I thought that, you know what, I have to change, and I have to change immediately. And that's when it became really difficult.
He's worked with Scorsese, survived Michael Bay blockbusters, and built a massive empire. But Mark Wahlberg still has a serious list of people he can't stand. At 54, Wahlberg is reportedly naming the 6 celebrities he utterly hates. Leonardo DiCaprio. When people talk about 90s stars who didn't just shine for a moment, but actually stayed on top, Leonardo DiCaprio and Mark Wahlberg are always part of that conversation. Their paths into Hollywood were completely different, but somehow they both ended up in the same place, right at the top. DiCaprio came in as the classic child actor with serious talent. Over time, he evolved into that rare leading man every director wanted. His resume speaks for itself, stacked with films like Titanic, Inception, and The Wolf of Wall Street. Projects that didn't just succeed, they defined eras. Wahlberg's journey looked nothing like that. Before Hollywood, he was known as Marky Mark, fronting a rap group and building a name in music. The transition into acting could have gone sideways, but instead, it turned into one of the smartest moves of his career. He carved out his own lane with films like The Perfect Storm, Ted, and the blockbuster Transformers series. From the outside, their relationship has always looked solid. 2 heavyweights who came up in the same era and managed to stay relevant. They didn't just cross paths socially either. They shared the screen more than once. Their most famous collaboration came in The Departed, a gritty crime drama that's now considered a modern classic. But their story together actually started much earlier, back in The Basketball Diaries. At first glance, everything about that early collaboration looked smooth. There's even old footage showing a teenage DiCaprio casually asking Wahlberg if they should be friends, with Wahlberg agreeing on the spot. It felt natural, almost effortless. On camera and off, they seemed to click. But behind that easy chemistry was a completely different reality. Both of them were under pressure, and not the usual kind. This wasn't just another role, it was a turning point. For Wahlberg, the stakes were obvious. Most people still saw him as a rapper trying to act. This film was his chance to prove he belonged in a completely different world. If it didn't work, that transition might have ended before it really began. For DiCaprio, it was about range. He was already gaining attention, but this role pushed him into darker territory. It was a deliberate move to show he could handle complex, heavy material, setting the stage for everything that came next. What makes the story even more interesting is that neither of them initially believed in the other's casting. DiCaprio wasn't sold on the idea of working with Wahlberg, partly due to a previous run-in that left a bad impression. Wahlberg, on the other hand, questioned whether DiCaprio could convincingly play the kind of street-hardened character the role demanded. Both of them walked into the situation with doubts and a bit of ego. Things didn't exactly start off smoothly either. When it came time for a key chemistry read, Wahlberg showed up hours late after travel issues threw everything off schedule. By the time he arrived, the tension in the room was real. DiCaprio wasn't hiding his frustration. But then something shifted. Once they actually stepped into the scene and started working, the energy changed. The same tension that could have derailed everything ended up fueling the performance. The producers saw it immediately. There was something real there, something that worked. That moment broke the ice. What started as resistance slowly turned into respect. Looking back, both actors have admitted that the early friction was mutual. Each of them had their own assumptions about the other, and neither was entirely wrong from their perspective. Wahlberg carried the image of a loud, unpredictable rapper trying to break into serious acting. DiCaprio, despite his talent, hadn't yet proven himself in the kind of gritty, street-level role this film demanded. They had to work through that, and in doing so, they built something real. The rivalry didn't disappear overnight, but it evolved. After that initial clash, they began to understand each other, not just as actors, but as competitors pushing toward the same goal. A lot of that early tension can be traced back to a brief encounter at a celebrity basketball event, where Wahlberg's attitude rubbed DiCaprio the wrong way. At the time, it just looked like a small moment. In reality, it set the tone for everything that followed. Still, the film's director, Scott Calvert, saw potential where others saw risk. Having worked with Wahlberg before in music videos, he knew there was more there than people realized. That belief gave Wahlberg the opening he needed, and he didn't waste it. By the time filming wrapped, both actors had proven their point. Wahlberg showed he was more than just a music star experimenting with acting. DiCaprio confirmed he could carry emotionally intense roles with depth and authenticity. More importantly, they earned each other's respect. Years later, that rocky beginning feels like part of the story rather than a problem. The tension that once threatened to derail their collaboration ended up shaping it. What started as doubt turned into one of the more genuine friendships in Hollywood. And today, with both careers firmly established, that early friction is long gone. If anything, it laid the foundation for a bond that's lasted decades, one built not on instant chemistry, but on earning it the hard way. David O. Russell. Hollywood is full of friendships that look unbreakable, until they're not. And one of the most surprising fallouts came from the longtime partnership between Mark Wahlberg and David O. Russell. What once looked like a ride-or-die creative bond eventually unraveled into something far more complicated. For years, the two operated like a tight unit. Wahlberg trusted Russell's vision, and Russell consistently backed Wahlberg as a leading man. But things started to fall apart during the development of Silver Linings Playbook, a project that would go on to become one of Russell's biggest successes. At one point, Wahlberg was closely attached to the lead role. Then, somewhere along the line, the studio shifted direction. Bradley Cooper stepped in instead. On paper, it looked like a standard casting change. Behind the scenes, it carried a lot more weight. According to people close to the production, part of the decision came down to money and flexibility. Cooper was seen as more willing to adjust financially to fit the film's budget. Meanwhile, Wahlberg's deal had certain conditions that made things more expensive, especially after Anne Hathaway exited the project, which reportedly triggered a significant pay increase in his contract. What might have been a routine business decision didn't feel routine at all to Wahlberg. From his perspective, this wasn't just about a role slipping away, it was about loyalty. He had stood by Russell during a difficult period in the director's career. When Russell's reputation took a hit after the troubled production of I Heart Huckabees, including widely publicized on-set conflicts, many in Hollywood kept their distance. Wahlberg did the opposite. He backed Russell and brought him into The Fighter, a project that ended up changing everything. That film wasn't just a comeback, it was a statement. It performed well commercially, earned critical praise, and re-established Russell as a serious force in the industry. The recognition followed quickly. Russell received a Best Director nomination, while the film itself gained major awards attention, with Christian Bale and Melissa Leo winning Oscars for their performances. In many ways, The Fighter reopened doors that had been closed to Russell. It set the stage for what would become Silver Linings Playbook. And that's what made the casting change sting even more. From Wahlberg's point of view, he had helped rebuild something, only to be left out when it paid off. As Silver Linings Playbook moved forward, it assembled a strong cast. Robert De Niro and Jackie Weaver joined the project, while Jennifer Lawrence took on a central role that would later earn widespread acclaim. The film went on to achieve both commercial success and major awards recognition, further cementing Russell's return to the top tier of directors. But behind that success, the relationship between Wahlberg and Russell had already fractured. Communication between them reportedly broke down completely. Projects they had once discussed together began to shift in different directions. One of those projects was Two Guns, which eventually moved forward without Russell's involvement. Wahlberg instead collaborated with Baltasar Kormákur, signaling a clear change in creative partnerships. At the same time, Wahlberg began exploring the possibility of continuing the story of the fighter. But even there, the message from his side was clear. If a sequel were to happen, it wouldn't include Russell. What started as a powerful collaboration built on trust and shared ambition ultimately came undone over a mix of business decisions and personal expectations. In Hollywood, those two things are often impossible to separate. And in this case, a partnership that once revived a career ended up becoming another example of how quickly things can change when success, money, and loyalty all collide. Kate Moss. To really understand how Calvin Klein turned a pair of jeans into a cultural moment, everything goes back to 1980. That was the year a teenage Brooke Shields stepped in front of the camera and changed the game completely. She was just 15, dressed in tight denim, staring straight down the lens with a confidence that felt way beyond her years. The commercial was simple, black and white, nothing flashy. But then came the line that stuck. It was bold, a little provocative, and impossible to ignore. Just like that, Calvin Klein jeans weren't just clothes anymore. They were a statement. That moment didn't just fade away either. It lingered, built a reputation, and set a tone that the brand would keep coming back to. So a little over a decade later, Calvin Klein decided to tap into that same energy again. But this time, they pushed it even further. Enter the early 1990s. The brand went back to black and white, stripped things down again, and introduced a new duo that would end up defining an era. Mark Wahlberg, still going by Marky Mark at the time, and a young Kate Moss. The campaign was meant to promote underwear, but it quickly became something much bigger than that. Wahlberg leaned all the way into his image. At that point, he was known more for his music and his attitude than for acting. His whole persona revolved around that rebellious edge. Low-slung jeans, visible boxers, a chip on his shoulder, and a kind of raw confidence that felt unpredictable. Standing next to him was Kate Moss, who, at the time, was just stepping into the spotlight. She didn't have the global recognition yet. This campaign would change that overnight. The ads themselves didn't hold back. In one of the most talked about visuals, Moss is perched on Wahlberg's lap, barely covered, while he plays directly to the camera with that same cocky energy. The tone echoed the Brooke Shields campaign, but it wasn't just suggestive anymore. It was louder, more in your face, and impossible to escape. These images were everywhere, from billboards to magazine spreads, and they burned themselves into pop culture. If the original jeans campaign made noise, this one felt like an explosion. But behind all that iconic imagery, the reality on set told a very different story, especially for Kate Moss. Years later, when the dust had long settled, and those images had already been cemented as fashion history, Moss finally opened up about what that experience was actually like for her. Speaking on BBC Radio 4's Desert Island Discs, she made it clear that the memories weren't nearly as glamorous as they looked from the outside. She had been just 18 at the time, still finding her footing in an industry that can be overwhelming even for seasoned professionals. Walking onto that set, she found herself surrounded by Wahlberg and his crew, a whole entourage that made the environment feel even more intense. From her perspective, it wasn't exciting, It was intimidating. Wahlberg, on the other hand, was already a known figure. But his reputation wasn't exactly polished. His past included run-ins with the law. And even though he was trying to turn things around, that rough edge was still very much part of how people saw him. That energy carried into the shoot, and for Moss, it only added to the discomfort. Looking back, she described the atmosphere as off. Not openly hostile, but not exactly welcoming either. There wasn't much connection between them. In fact, she later explained that they barely spoke during the entire process. And then there was the nature of the shoot itself. The poses, the styling, the expectations, they all pushed her into a space where she felt exposed in more ways than one. Sitting topless on Wahlberg's lap while cameras clicked around her wasn't something she experienced as empowering. Instead, she felt objectified, reduced to an image rather than treated as a person. Even Calvin Klein himself later acknowledged that the situation wasn't smooth behind the scenes. He admitted that Wahlberg could be difficult at the time, describing him as trouble in his own way. At the same time, he noted that Moss was dealing with her own personal struggles, which added another layer to an already tense environment. Despite all of that, the final product didn't show any cracks. The images came out exactly as intended, striking, memorable, and powerful enough to define an entire era of fashion advertising. But for Moss, the cost of that success was real. In later interviews, she didn't hold back. She spoke openly about feeling vulnerable and scared, suggesting that her youth played a role in how the campaign was shaped. There was a sense that her innocence had been part of the appeal, something the brand leaned into without fully considering how it affected her. At one point, she even revealed that the experience contributed to a serious mental health breakdown. It hit her so hard that she struggled to function afterward, feeling overwhelmed to the point where she couldn't get out of bed for weeks. Her words painted a picture that stood in sharp contrast to the polished images people remembered. Wahlberg, for his part, didn't entirely push back on that version of events. When asked about the shoot years later, he admitted that he probably wasn't the easiest person to work with back then. He described himself as rough around the edges, focused more on his own mindset than on how others around him were feeling. There was an acknowledgement there, even if it wasn't deeply reflective. At the same time, he seemed genuinely unaware of just how negatively Moss had experienced the situation. When the topic came up in interviews, he spoke as if there had been no lasting tension, mentioning that they had crossed paths in later years and kept things cordial. Interestingly, Moss's perspective wasn't entirely one note either. Back when the campaign first dropped in the early 90s, she had already tried to clear up some of the public assumptions. Despite how intimate the images looked, she made it clear there was no real chemistry between them. What people saw on camera didn't reflect what was happening off it. Years later, she added a bit more nuance. While she stood by her feelings of discomfort, she also acknowledged that there wasn't much personal interaction between them to begin with. In her words, it felt like stepping into a completely different world, one that didn't quite match who she was at the time. And in a small but telling detail, she did describe Wahlberg as a nice guy in his own way, even if their connection never really formed. In the end, what came out of that campaign was bigger than both of them. It reshaped fashion advertising, launched careers, and created images that people still recognize decades later. But behind the legacy, there were two very different experiences unfolding at the same time. One that built an empire, and another that left a lasting personal impact. That contrast is what makes the story stick. Not just because of what people saw, but because of everything they didn't. Andy Serkis. Back in 2017, there was a moment on The Graham Norton Show that people still bring up whenever Mark Wahlberg, and Andy Serkis are mentioned in the same sentence. It looked like a regular celebrity sit-down at first, but once the clips started making rounds online, viewers locked in on one thing: they were convinced something felt off. To a lot of fans, Mark didn't seem impressed. In fact, some thought he looked straight-up jealous of Andy. Now, Mark Wahlberg has always had that complicated relationship with the public. On paper, his career speaks loud enough. The man has stacked hits, carried major franchises, and proven time and time again that audiences will show up for him. But at the same time, he's never quite shaken that reputation of being a little hard to read, sometimes coming off colder than intended. That perception has followed him for years, and moments like this only add fuel to the fire. By 2023, that tension between Wahlberg and public opinion hadn't exactly cooled off either. When rumors started floating around about him possibly stepping away from acting, the internet didn't react with heartbreak across the board. One viral comment summed it up in a way that was both funny and brutal. Someone celebrated the idea like it was a victory. That kind of reaction says a lot about how divided people are on him. So when this Graham Norton appearance started trending again, it didn't take much for people to jump to conclusions. The narrative practically wrote itself. Was this another example of Wahlberg rubbing people the wrong way? Or were viewers reading too much into a few seconds of body language? The episode aired on June 16, 2017, and the lineup alone felt unreal. Wahlberg was joined by Sienna Miller, Tom Holland, Woody Harrelson, and Alison Moyet, who handled the music. But the spotlight kept drifting back to Andy Serkis, and for good reason. At the time, Serkis was promoting War for the Planet of the Apes, the latest chapter in a reboot series that had completely redefined what modern sci-fi could look like. The franchise had already built serious momentum after Rise of the Planet of the Apes pulled in massive numbers and earned critical respect. By the time this third film rolled around, expectations were high, and Serkis was right at the center of it all, once again stepping into the role of Caesar through performance capture. When Graham Norton asked him about the film, Serkis didn't try to dress it up as a simple good versus evil story. He explained it as something much heavier. In his view, it was a war story where nobody really walks away clean. Humans and apes were both pushed to their limits, and the emotional weight of that conflict was what drove the film. It wasn't just spectacle, it had heart, even if that heart came through pain. That depth is part of what made Serkis such a respected figure in Hollywood. Over the years, he had built a reputation as a pioneer, someone who blurred the line between physical acting and digital performance. From massive fantasy epics to comic book blockbusters, his presence was everywhere, even if audiences didn't always see his face on screen. On that night, though, there was nothing hidden about his performance. Serkis came in with energy and fully leaned into the moment. He started sharing stories from set, breaking down how he physically becomes characters like Caesar. Then he took things up a notch. He brought out the extended arm crutches he uses to recreate ape movement. That's when the whole studio lit up. The crowd was hooked instantly. There's something about seeing that level of commitment up close that pulls people in. And Serkis knew exactly how to play to that energy. He demonstrated the movements, shifting his posture, changing his rhythm, showing just how much work goes into making those characters feel real. Tom Holland couldn't even stay seated. He jumped in, eager to try it out for himself, clearly enjoying every second of it. The moment had that kind of loose, unpredictable energy that makes talk shows feel alive. But while most of the couch seemed locked into the fun, viewers at home noticed a contrast. Mark Wahlberg, sitting right there, didn't react the same way. Where others leaned in, he leaned back. Where the room felt playful, he seemed more reserved. Online, that difference didn't go unnoticed. Some people read his expression as disinterest. Others went further, calling it condescending, like he thought the whole demonstration was beneath him. A few even framed it as insecurity, suggesting that watching Serkis command the room might have hit a nerve. The comments started stacking up quickly. Some viewers joked that Wahlberg looked like he was too cool for what they saw as harmless fun, especially compared to how much Sienna Miller and the rest of the guests seemed to enjoy it. Others didn't hold back at all, claiming he looked intimidated by Serkis's talent and presence. It created this strange split-screen effect in people's minds. On one side, there was Serkis, fully immersed, creative, and clearly in his element. On the other, there was Wahlberg, quieter, more contained, and, depending on who you asked, possibly uncomfortable. That's where the jealousy theory really took off. And to understand why, people started connecting dots that go back years before that interview. Long before the reboot trilogy took over, Wahlberg had his own run with the Planet of the Apes franchise. In 2001, he starred in Tim Burton's version of the story. It had the budget, the scale, and the hype to be a major hit. And financially, it wasn't a failure. The film brought in over $300 million worldwide, which, on paper, looks solid. But the reception told a different story. Critics weren't kind to it, and fans didn't exactly rally behind it either. It ended up becoming one of those films that made money but didn't leave much of a legacy. Meanwhile, the reboot series that Serkis helped lead didn't just succeed. It raised the bar completely, both critically and commercially. The newer films weren't just better received, they were seen as redefining the franchise. Stronger storytelling, more emotional depth, and groundbreaking visual effects turned them into something people took seriously. Plans even started forming around expanding the universe into a much larger saga. That contrast between Wahlberg's version and the reboot became impossible to ignore. So when viewers watched the Graham Norton clip, they weren't just seeing two actors on a couch. In their minds, they were seeing two different eras of the same franchise, with very different outcomes. That's why some of the online reactions felt so personal. People brought up Wahlberg's film directly, pointing out how different the reception was compared to what Serkis had been part of. Some comments were lighthearted, poking fun at the situation. Others were more direct, basically saying that where one version struggled, the other thrived. Still, there's another side to this story that often gets overlooked. If someone actually listens to what Wahlberg said during that interview, instead of just focusing on his body language, a different picture starts to form. He wasn't completely checked out. He stayed quiet during parts of Serkis's demonstration, sure. But when Tom Holland got involved, Wahlberg joined in, joking around, and encouraging him to keep going. And when the conversation turned toward his own experience with the franchise, he didn't dodge it. He addressed it head-on. Wahlberg admitted that his version of Planet of the Apes didn't quite live up to expectations. He spoke honestly about the experience, saying that while working with Tim Burton was something he valued, he felt like the film didn't push the franchise forward the way it should have. In his own words, it set things back a bit. That kind of honesty doesn't exactly line up with someone trying to act superior or dismissive. If anything, it shows a level of self-awareness that people don't always credit him for. Even among fans, there's a recognition of that gap between the 2001 film and the reboot series. Reviews over the years have pointed out how the earlier version feels simpler, less polished, and not as emotionally engaging. Some viewers have even said that watching it now makes the newer films look even better by comparison, almost like a reminder of how far the franchise has come. In that sense, Wahlberg's film became part of the journey, even if it wasn't the high point. So when it comes back to that moment on The Graham Norton Show, the truth probably sits somewhere in the middle. Maybe Wahlberg wasn't as outwardly enthusiastic as the others. Maybe his energy didn't match the room. But that doesn't automatically mean jealousy was driving it. Sometimes a quieter reaction is just that, a quieter reaction. And sometimes the internet just fills in the blanks with whatever story feels the most interesting. Eminem. Even though Mark Wahlberg has spent years working alongside some of the most respected names in modern cinema, directors like Martin Scorsese, Paul Thomas Anderson, and David O. Russell, he still finds himself oddly absent from conversations about the greatest actors of his generation. That gap, at least in part, comes down to inconsistency. For every critically acclaimed performance, there's another project that leaves audiences scratching their heads. His collaborations with Michael Bay on the Transformers films leaned heavily into blockbuster spectacle, while his role in M. Night Shyamalan's The Happening became an easy target for critics and online jokes. Scenes involving deadly plant life didn't exactly help his case, and moments like that tend to stick. But the full story of Wahlberg's career doesn't begin in Hollywood. It starts in music. In the early 90s, he stepped into the spotlight under a different identity. Marky Mark. As the frontman of Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch, he quickly found success. Their breakout hit Good Vibrations shot to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, turning him into a pop culture fixture almost overnight. The group rode that wave with a platinum album and even crossed into gaming with a tie-in title that, over time, gained a reputation for all the wrong reasons. By the end of the decade, the musical landscape had shifted. A new voice had taken center stage: Eminem. In 1999, both artists found themselves on the same episode of MTV's Total Request Live. On the surface, it looked like a meeting of two successful performers who had each carved out their own lane. Underneath, though, there was tension. Both had made the transition from music into acting, and comparisons between them came naturally. But Wahlberg had no interest in that narrative. In interviews, he made it clear that he saw his path as entirely separate. While he respected Eminem's talent, he drew a firm line between their public personas and personal lives. Where Eminem leaned into shock value and controversy, Wahlberg framed his own journey as an effort to move away from a troubled past, not amplify it. That difference in approach quietly fueled friction. During that TRL appearance, the atmosphere backstage was already uneasy. A request had reportedly been passed along asking that Wahlberg not be referred to by his old stage name. It didn't land well. When the cameras started rolling, Eminem slipped in a subtle jab, referencing the Funky Bunch era in a way that didn't go unnoticed. The tension didn't stay confined to television. In 2000, Eminem's album The Marshall Mathers LP included a quick but pointed line on the track Drug Ballad, revisiting Wahlberg's past with a dismissive edge. It was brief, almost easy to miss, but it confirmed that the rivalry, however low-key, was real. Years later, Eminem would explain that the awkwardness began in that backstage moment, where the energy felt off before either of them said a word on air. From his perspective, it was less about a single comment, and more about the underlying attitude in the room. Time, however, has a way of softening old conflicts. By 2017, Wahlberg openly acknowledged his side of the situation. Speaking candidly, he admitted that his earlier stance had been driven by jealousy. He gave Eminem credit where he felt it was due, recognizing both his skill and his impact. More importantly, he accepted that, at the time, Eminem had simply been the stronger rapper. What once felt like rivalry eventually settled into mutual respect. A reminder that even in industries built on competition, perspective can change with distance. Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise has built a reputation as one of the most relentless workers in Hollywood, the kind of actor who pushes himself to the limit for every role. But at one point, a comment he made about that grind didn't sit right with Mark Wahlberg, and it didn't just stay between them. It struck a nerve far beyond Hollywood. Back in 2013, Mark Wahlberg was deep in promotion mode for Lone Survivor, a film rooted in the real-life Operation Red Wings mission from 2005. He wasn't just selling a movie. He was carrying the weight of a story tied to real soldiers, real sacrifice, and real loss. Around that same time, a remark from Tom Cruise started circulating. In it, Cruise compared the intensity of filmmaking and the emotional toll of being away from his daughter to serving in Afghanistan. That comparison didn't land well. Not with Wahlberg, and definitely not with veterans who had actually lived through combat. To them, it felt like two completely different worlds being placed on the same level. The tension came to the surface during a Q&A at the Lone Survivor premiere. Wahlberg didn't mention Cruise by name, but the target of his frustration was obvious. Speaking candidly, he pushed back hard against the idea that actors could equate their preparation or on-set struggles with the lived reality of soldiers. In his view, there was a clear and undeniable line between portraying war and actually fighting one. For Wahlberg, the distinction was simple. Actors, no matter how intense their roles get, can step away when the cameras stop rolling. They return to comfort, routine, and safety. Soldiers don't have that option. Their reality doesn't cut to black at the end of the day. The criticism gained traction quickly, especially as more people weighed in on the broader issue. Wahlberg's stance wasn't just about one comment. It was about protecting the integrity of real-life sacrifice from being diluted by comparison. As the backlash grew, Cruise's side responded. His lawyer, Bert Fields, stepped in to clarify what had been said. According to him, Cruise's comment was never meant to be taken literally. He described it as a light-hearted remark, something said with a laugh to capture the exhaustion and long hours of filmmaking, not a serious attempt to compare it to military service. Fields emphasized that Cruise has long supported the troops and would never intentionally minimize their experiences. Even with that clarification, Wahlberg didn't shift much on his core message. For him, the issue wasn't about intent, it was about impact. No matter how demanding a film set might be, he believed it shouldn't be placed in the same conversation as war. Eventually, Wahlberg softened the personal edge of his response. In a later interview, he made it clear that he wasn't aiming directly at Cruise and even expressed respect for him. But he didn't walk back the principle behind what he said. In his eyes, honoring the reality of military service meant drawing a firm boundary, one that Hollywood, no matter how intense it gets, simply doesn't cross. In the end, the moment became less about a feud and more about perspective. On one side was an actor describing the pressures of his craft. On the other was a reminder that some experiences carry a weight that can't be recreated, no matter how real it may look on screen.